You're listening to the podcast of Iris Josephina. If you're passionate about exploring the menstrual cycle, cyclical living, body wisdom, personal growth, spirituality, and running a business in alignment with your natural cycles, you're in the right place. I'm Iris. I'm an entrepreneur, functional hormone specialist, trainer, and coach, and I am on a mission to share insights, fun facts, and inspiration I discover along the way as I run my business and walk my own path on Earth. Here, you'll hear my personal stories, guest interviews, and vulnerable shares from clients and students. Most people know me from Instagram, where you can find me under @CycleSeeds, or they have been a coaching client or student in one of my courses. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive into today's episode. So for this episode, I had the honor to sit down with Jonathan, and Jonathan is actually an undergrad student at Davidson College, and he studies biology and neuroscience, and he's on the PhD track. And he has an absolute passion, and you'll feel this and hear this and see this in the episode. He has an absolute passion for translating complex science and health topics for the general public so that all of us can understand it, so all of us can improve our lives by doing certain things that are super easy to do. And the topics that we mostly dove into were the topics of light and circadian biology. Why this is so important for us, why we are, so passionate about, bringing this wisdom out and help people understand their relationship with light, our relationship with screens, and how we can do better around that. What happens in our bodies when we don't honor the natural relationship with light that our bodies have, and what happens to our hormones, to our metabolism. And we also tied it in to women's hormone health. And I genuinely loved this episode so much. I hope you will love it as much as I did. And we hope that you learned something new. If you feel that you want to talk to us after, if you want to share your feedback or your aha moments, we are both very open to receive your messages on Instagram, which is the platform that both of us are most active on. And I just can't wait for you to dive into this episode and learn all these super cool things about your body, about light. And I cannot wait to hear from you after you finish the podcast, what you thought about it. Enjoy listening. Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Inner Rhythms podcast. I am here with Jonathan Jarecki, and I'm very, very excited to speak with him today because he is as passionate about circadian biology as I am. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Iris. I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, me too. So you mentioned before that you went through pre-med school, and then as you were going through all of that, you kind of decided to step away from that. And when you mentioned that on your Instagram, I was very curious what led you to take that step. What did you see in there that made you want to take a different direction?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. So I'm an undergrad right now. I go to Davidson College in North Carolina here in the States. And I, going into my undergrad, my freshman year, I knew I wanted to do something in STEM and in sciences. I had a great experience with my science classes in high school. And so I wanted to major in biology, minor in neuroscience. And that was definitely the path I wanted to take in terms of my major and minor and what I wanted to study in undergrad. And at the same time, there was also at Davidson, there's a ton of students who are pre-med. So they're on the pre-med track, wanting to go to med school after undergrad. And so I was around a lot of those students, and that definitely had an influence on it. And I sort of had this idea, all right, it would be awesome, if I could have this influence on the medical establishment, being in it with a different perspective. So that was sort of the track I wanted to go down. And yeah, so I was on the pre-med track. And it wasn't until a few months ago that I decided to quit it. So I was raised in a very holistic household. We focused a lot on, alternative medicine and didn't really go to the doctor very much growing up. Didn't go to the doctor at all besides yearly checkups. So, my mom raised us with that idea that, if you take the right approach, you don't necessarily need the doctor, at least to the extent of how people are using the doctor today. Obviously, there's a time and place, if there's a tragic accident or something like that, it's good to go to the doctor. But for the most part, like, never took medications or anything like that. So I had that mindset already from my childhood and growing up, and still of the same mindset today. And so it was definitely interesting because I was one to have much different perspectives on many different areas in this field than pretty much like than a lot of my peers, and different than the standard medical establishment, and I have a lot of disagreements with the standard medical establishment. So after like a lot of thought and some other stuff, I decided that it probably wouldn't be best for me. And at the same time, I also had this passion and have this passion for research. I love research, and really, research is the foundation of what doctors sort of take on for their understanding. And then textbooks are obviously all on the research that we have. So if we can advance research in these areas, then hopefully, we could have a big effect on an influence on the medical establishment. So I think research is key, and I love it so much. I mean, obviously you're seeing like on my Instagram, I share a ton about the research around a ton of different topics, mainly being light, of course. And so I decided to quit. I think it was the best option. So, right now I'm currently focused on research. I'll be doing some research next semester with one of my professors, and also wanting to, continue that in the long term. And one of the big things is like continuing that on a more science communication background. So wanting to communicate the science with the public, because I think if we can get the science in the hands of the public, I think that's the biggest thing, and giving them the information that they could utilize for their health, to hopefully, improve their lives and improve their health, so they don't have to rely on the standard medical establishment. Because, I mean, we see it today. I mean, chronic disease is at an all-time high, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, all these things. And quite frankly, they're not, for the most part, they're not lowering, right? They're only going up. And we need big change. And it comes from a lifestyle, right? We can prevent the vast majority of these diseases can be absolutely prevented with lifestyle approaches. And it's starting young, right? So it's like we need to start this as soon as possible, from in terms of like babies and children. But obviously, even if you're in your older ages, like you can have dramatic effects reversing chronic disease as well. So it's not only prevention, but it's also reversal. So yeah, that's sort of, a little bit about why I wanted to step away from that. And, ultimately it just wasn't aligned with the views that I had and what I wanted to do. At the same time, I have a bunch of my friends who are going into med school after undergrad, and a lot of, like, more than I would expect, have this understanding of lifestyle on health. So I think things are coming around, especially with the newer generation going into the medical field. They're seeing that, well, one, they're seeing all the chronic disease that is burdening our society, and I think they're understanding gradually that lifestyle can have a effect on that, and you can prevent it and you can reverse these diseases. So I'm very hopeful for the future in terms of the medical establishment. But yeah, for me, wanted to take a step back there.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's such a good angle to really want to focus on research and specifically want to bring it to the public. I once read an article and it stated that it takes about 17 years for research to actually land into clinical practice, which is an insanely long time. Like, people need help now. Like, what are you talking about? The research is there. Apply it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. And that's sort of just the fault of how like science works. But I think what's really great is that if we can get, a research paper can come out, and the next day you can post something on social media now about it, and like get the word out that way. So I think that's what's really great about social media. Obviously, social media has its pros and cons, but one of the pros is that, we can get this information out more readily and more easily. Whereas, like you said, a textbook, I mean, textbooks are 20 years behind what we currently understand, and what we currently understand is many years behind what is actually reality, so there's a big delay in research and in medicine for sure.
Yeah. And I also like that you mentioned that there is really this movement where people understand that lifestyle is really at the foundation. It's interesting because in my language, all of these newer diseases and chronic things that come up, we actually literally translate, we call it lifestyle diseases that are induced by how people create their environments and create their lifestyles.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
So you mentioned before that you are mainly focusing on light, and light in relation to human bodies is really part of the field of circadian biology. For someone hearing circadian biology for the first time, why is that important and why is light the thing that we should organize everything else around?
Yeah, great question. So let's first take a step back and like what is a circadian rhythm, right? So our bodies have this clock in them. It's this intrinsic clock that runs throughout our body. And there's a central clock. So the central clock is in our brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus of the brain. And this central clock, it is essentially a clock, right? So it's this roughly 24-hour clock. So on average, humans, circadian clock is around, it's just over 24 hours. So it's around like 24.2 hours, which is important. So let's say we put someone in like a cave where they're not exposed to any environmental cues like light, right? Put them in a cave for long periods of time. What's going to happen is their intrinsic clock within their body is going to run at a 24.2-hour rhythm. So it's going to start getting delayed as the days go on because it's not getting entrained by the 24-hour light dark cycle. So this circadian rhythm will run automatically whether we have light exposed to us or not. But the primary sort of timekeeper of the circadian rhythm is light. So we do utilize light to sort of entrain that circadian rhythm. So our internal clock is aligned with the rhythm of the light dark cycle of the earth wherever we're located, right? So that's really important there. And the circadian system governs practically every single cell and every single organ of our body. So we have this central circadian clock that basically talks to all of our cells, telling all our cells what time of day it is, which then tells our cells, okay, release this hormone at this time, release this protein at this time, translate and transcribe this protein in X. So it's doing all these processes and it's controlling all these processes as well. At the same time, we also have peripheral clocks. So we have clocks in our muscles, we have clocks in our gut, we have clocks in our heart. So we have these peripheral clocks that talk to each other and communicate with the central clock. These clock systems within our body govern pretty much every single facet of biology. And, we want that entrainment to occur from the light is the primary thing. So our clocks can also get entrained by other cues. So, these are called zeitgebers or timekeepers. The main one is light. There's also food. Food affects the rhythm. So what time we're eating, right? We don't want to eat late into the night, things like that. Also, exercise affects the circadian clock, things like that. But the main timekeeper is light. And this makes sense, right? Because when we look at it from like a primordial standpoint, our primordial existence we would have been outdoors 24/7, being exposed to the light dark cycle of the earth. And that is going to, affect when we need different hormones being produced and all things like that. So that's really the foundation there. And this circadian system again has also I think it makes sense if it governs every single cell and every single organ in our body. Well, it's going to have effects on health outcomes, right? So we can look at epidemiological evidence and also mechanistic evidence, but if we misalign the circadian clock, if the circadian clock is not aligned to the light dark cycle, well, we have downstream effects. So this has effects on, again, pretty much every single disease. It has effects of diabetes, that effects on cardiovascular disease, on cancer, specific cancers like breast cancer, colorectal cancers are big ones there. But it really has effect on pretty much every single disease that we know of. And like ulcerative colitis, there was a paper that came out a few months ago on ulcerative colitis, on how the circadian system affects that. So pretty much every single thing has a circadian component. So the circadian system is vital to live properly in alignment with how your body is meant to be living. And I think, when we look at our current society, right, we are having very dim days. So we're indoors a ton. We're not being exposed to light a ton. In our mornings, we're not really getting outside very much, right? I know for Americans, the stat is 93% of Americans' day is spent indoors. Right. And a lot of the times, people wake up and the first light they're exposed to is their phone, and they'll start scrolling on their phone, and they probably stay indoors for the rest of their morning, not exposing themselves to bright light in the mornings. And then at night, the opposite, right? We have bright nights. So we turn on the lights at night everywhere you go. We have light pollution just in general from outdoor lights like, lampposts and things like that. But also the indoor environment has tons of artificial light at night. And that, again, is affecting that circadian system. Essentially, the nighttime one, I think, is easy for people to understand. It's like when you're exposing yourself to bright light at night, it's essentially telling your body that it's daytime when it's not, right? So it's giving the wrong cue to your body when you should be getting the cue it's nighttime do the nighttime things, right? So, in that we can touch on what all that stuff is, but that's essentially a little bit of a rundown of like what the circadian system is and why it is so important. Again, it's affecting everything we do.
For sure. And I mean, I work with female hormones and fertility and all that kind of stuff. And I really dove deep into how circadian rhythm and circadian clocks connect to fertility, spermatogenesis, ovarian health. Like it's insane how all of
Yeah.
that is connected. And
Hmm.
I don't think IVF clinics even think about that.
No,
But
yeah. I mean, yeah.
as you say, it's connected to every single process in the body.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even like there's some great, research coming out now. It's like even with cancer therapies and just like medications in general, it's like we're giving these medications and cancer therapies, which in them of itself have problems, but we're giving them also like at a time of day where we're not even considering, where there's actually an effect on the time of day we give these therapies and these
Oh, wow.
medications on the system. So, you know, and again, there's a whole rabbit hole of like these medications also have all their side effects in and of themselves, but we're increasing those side effects by giving them at times a day when we shouldn't be giving them, right? So
Mm.
there's even that. It really governs so many things.
Yeah, so let's take it back to this first light in the morning, right? Could
Yeah.
you walk us through what actually is happening inside the body on in these first few minutes or 15 minutes that we are exposed to this first light? And I'm sure it needs to
Yep.
happen in a specific time frame. You can't have your first light at 1 p.m., for
Yeah.
example. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
could you walk us
Yeah.
through it?
Yeah, so ideally, right, the ideal scenario is we're exposing ourselves to sunrise. Now,
Mhm.
obviously, that's gonna the time of that is gonna depend on where you are located, and that's gonna, I think when I would say let's just think about this as at the equator, right? I mean, our primordial existence is at the equator, and obviously, as humans evolved, we moved away from the equator. But at the equator, it's a 12 hour day, 12-hour night. And when we get up in the morning, right, we're exposing ourselves to sunrise. And what's happening when we're exposing ourselves to sunrise? A couple things. So one, there's a contrast in the sky at sunrise, and that contrast in and of itself, that orange blue contrast in the sky, communicates to our cones. So we have different cells in our retina. We have rods and cones, which most people are familiar about. We also have what's called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So these are non-visual forming cells within the retina. So the rods and cones affect the visual system, so they allow us to actually see stuff. The intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, they don't allow us to see stuff. They simply communicate these light cues. So when we expose ourselves to the sunrise and we see that contrast, what's actually happening, there's a beautiful paper published in Cell, I believe in 2020. So this is actually recent. This is a recent finding where it's that contrast in and of itself communicates to or it sends a signal to our cones in our eyes, which then communicates to the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, enhancing that signal to those ganglion cells, which then those ganglion cells will send a signal to our suprachiasmatic nucleus, the central circadian clock within the brain, telling the brain, okay, it's daytime, stimulating that daytime process. Now, as the sun continues to rise, what happens is obviously that contrast starts to go away. The sky starts to get much more brighter and much more bluer. So now you're having more blue light coming to you, and you're having a much brighter light coming to you as that sun is rising. And that blueness and that brightness and also that angle is directly affecting those ganglion cells. So now this is a different process than that contrast. So that brightness and that blueness and that angle stimulates those retinal ganglion cells, again stimulating that circadian system, essentially entraining the circadian system. So what you're doing, you're anchoring in that morning time. So that morning sort of signal for the circadian system, you're anchoring that in for, it's like, all right, now we have that system in place. So we're entraining the rhythm, because again, that rhythm will start shifting if we're not getting the light. So if we get that light in the morning, we're anchoring the system for it to go for the rest of the day. Now, that's the sort of the phase, right? And so we're getting that bright light into the eyes, and ideally, a minimum of like 15 minutes is really what we want. Now, on an overcast day, we want to have more than that. We want to do probably 30 minutes, but on a bright, clear day, 15 minutes is that minimum that we want. Now, it's not necessary that you see the sunrise, although that is obviously the ideal scenario. It's not necessary. You're still gonna, even if you wake up, let's say you wake up early, but the sunrise already occurred, still getting outside within the first hour of waking up and viewing just that brightness and that blueness and that angle of light is still going to stimulate that circadian system and entrain that circadian system. So it's just the sunrise plus the continued sunrise is going to have the largest effect. But again, don't necessarily need the sunrise. So that's sort of how we anchor the circadian system for the morning hours. Now, what's really interesting, and you mentioned like the timing, right? So the morning is gonna, so when we look at the circadian system, we have two main things. There's the phase of the circadian system. So that is sort of like the length of it, but then there's the amplitude as well. And the amplitude of the rhythm is basically how high up that rhythm, that wave goes. And that's like the strength of the rhythm. Now, when we expose ourselves to bright light in the morning, we're affecting the phase of the rhythm and training that phase, but we're also affecting that amplitude. We're strengthening the amplitude. Now, what's really interesting, and I think this messaging, and I've actually just become aware of this within the past few weeks. I had a conversation with Dr. Sean Kane, who's one of the leading circadian biologists out there. He's had some tremendous papers that him and his team have published. I talked to him about this, what's considered a circadian dead zone. So there's this idea of a circadian dead zone, meaning in the middle of the day, we cannot affect the circadian system at all. And this is sort of what has been talked about within the circadian realm on like social media and things like that. I talked to him and I asked him about this circadian dead zone. Turns out that nocturnal rodents, so, mice that, are awake at night but asleep during the day, they do have a circadian dead zone. So you shine bright light on a nocturnal rodent during their day. In the middle of the day, you cannot affect the circadian system. However, when we look at diurnal rodents, which we are diurnal, right? But when we look at diurnal rodent models in mice who are awake during the day and are asleep at night, we can shine bright light in the middle of their day and throughout their day, and we can affect the circadian system. So there is no circadian dead zone for these diurnal mice. The specific thing that we're affecting is the amplitude. So we cannot, it doesn't seem that we can shift the phase of the rhythm, but we can affect the amplitude of the rhythm and the strength of the rhythm. That I was talking to Sean Kane. He even argues that it's an even more important factor, that amplitude, that strength of the rhythm, than the phase of the rhythm. And we can strengthen the phase with bright light on these diurnal rodents. Now let's look at the human studies. We actually have a handful of like very well done human studies doing the exact same thing, irrespective of morning light. So irrespective of getting bright light into the eyes in the morning, getting bright light into the eyes during the day, in the middle of the day, increases that strength of the rhythm, increases the amplitude of the rhythm in humans. These are human studies. So there doesn't seem to be a circadian dead zone to the extent of you cannot affect the rhythm. You can still strengthen the rhythm in the middle of the day. So that's really to say, like, if someone doesn't get their morning sunlight, although it's extremely important to still get your morning sunlight, so that right when you wake up, get out there as soon as possible. But if someone doesn't get that, it's not like you now sort of lost the circadian effect that you can get if you just go outside to get bright light into the eyes during the middle of the day, right? So, and this doesn't have to be direct sunlight. So even if you're under shade, you're still getting tons and tons of bright light. So we measure brightness of light in lux, and when we measure lux outdoors on a bright sunny day, we can have up to like 250,000 lux. Indoor environment, you'd be lucky if you're at like 1,000 lux. Now, if you have a ton of windows, maybe you can get to that 1,000 lux mark. But for the most part, the average indoor environment is like 500 lux. So much dimmer indoors than it is outdoors. So even under shade, you're getting tons and tons of bright light. So that's sort of the thing that I think about there in terms of the morning and the daytime. And then at night, I think it's important to touch on this as well. When we expose our eyes to artificial light at night, when we look at, and again, Sean Kane has a beautiful paper published on this, on looking at just the indoor home environments, right? And when we look at the melanopic lux, so the ability for light to stimulate the melanopsin within these ganglion cells in our eyes, when we look at sunset melanopic lux, it drops dramatically until the sun is obviously set, and then there's no light outdoors in the environment. Within like a 20-30 minute frame, you're going from high melanopic lux to practically zero. Now, when we look at the built environment, that melanopic lux, that ability for light to stimulate the circadian system, continues all the way out through the night, because people are being exposed to artificial light at night that's stimulating those cells, stimulating the circadian system, telling your body it's daytime well into the late night hours. And what's happening there is you are shifting your two things. Again, going back to the phase and the amplitude, you're shifting the phase. So you are one, I think it's easy to think of like melatonin and cortisol for these scenarios, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Melatonin, we want high amounts of melatonin at night. Now, what's happening when you're exposing yourself to artificial light at night? You're shifting that melatonin onset. So now melatonin is going to start being produced much later into the night once you start not exposing yourself to artificial light. So once you get that light dim, then your melatonin is going to be produced. But we're extending that far into the night with our current modern environments. At the same time, you're also reducing and blunting the amplitude of the rhythm when you expose yourself to artificial light. So not only at night, let's just think about you go camping. Sun sets, it's dark. What happens is you have a nice melatonin onset, so melatonin starts getting produced early, but also you have a nice amplitude in that melatonin rhythm. So you have a ton of melatonin. The strength of that rhythm is strong, so you're producing a lot of melatonin. Now, when we expose ourselves to artificial light, not only are we phase shifting the melatonin rhythm, but we're also dampening the melatonin rhythm. So we're not producing as much melatonin as well. So you're having those two effects that are going to obviously have downstream effects, and that's just the melatonin example, but there's a ton of other ones. I mean, again, cortisol, artificial light at night, it's going to spike the cortisol. We want low cortisol at night. But again, this is affecting everything. So it's not just those two hormones, but everything else. But those are just two easy ones to understand. So that's really how I think about morning, daytime, and nighttime light on the circadian system. And it's the best thing is it's super simple to get back in line. It's not it's not any crazy thing. So it's like get bright light in the morning, get bright light throughout the day, and get as little amount of light as night at night. And that's really the main thing for people to do.
Yeah, I usually tell my clients brighter days, darker nights. Simple.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. And yeah, you've mentioned how how our screen exposure basically almost like messes with the ability of our bodies to respond to that.
Yep.
What are some of the downstream effects that you have seen or studied or heard about when people don't honor this circadian rhythm, specifically of light, and don't have like red lights in their house or dim the lights at night? What are some of the downstream effects that could happen for people that they're maybe even not aware of?
Yeah, so I think this is a huge one that, I think, again, people are not aware of. The international agencies have literally classified night shift as a probable human carcinogen. So group 2A carcinogen, so probable human carcinogen for night shift workers. And what's happening with night shift? They're being exposed to artificial light throughout the night. And, I would make the argument that pretty much like every modern human is a night shift worker at this point, So night shift and just getting artificial light into the eyes at night, and getting that bright light at night when we're not supposed to is going to have effect on cancer, right? So we see when we look at epidemiological evidence, brighter nighttime light and getting exposed to artificial light at night is correlated with higher rates of pretty much every single type of cancer. It's very emphasized with breast cancer and colorectal cancer and things like that. But for many, many cancers, we have higher rates of cancers with getting more light at night. And then, we look at more mechanistic stuff, and we can do these same experiments on animals. We can shine light onto these animals at night, and we see increased rates of tumors in these animals. And so, and again, that's gonna have, there's a lot of mechanisms at play there, but one of the main things is tumor suppression. So all of our tumor suppressor genes and proteins are governed by the circadian system. So they are, these tumor proteins, that the tumor suppressing proteins that suppress tumors and regulate tumor growth, are expressed at certain times of the day and are not expressed at other times of the day. Now, if that, again, it's a rhythm, it's a cyclical rhythm. If that rhythm of these tumor suppressor proteins are misaligned, well, then we're gonna not be able to regulate tumor growth and cancer growth and things like this. So that's really what we're seeing there. And there's other effects on that, but that's really the main mechanism. I think also, so cancer is a big one. Cardiovascular disease, the American Heart Association actually came out with a public statement. I think it was 2025. So I think later, at the late of 2025, they came out with a public statement expressing how that cardiovascular disease, a big player of it is circadian rhythm and circadian misalignment and circadian disruption. So this is the American Heart Association acknowledging this, So there's players there. Again, your heart has a circadian clock, so there's cardiometabolic effects there. And again, pretty much all the epidemiological evidence that we have shows that as well. I would say another big one, and we have great human lab experiments on this, is metabolism and diabetes and things like that. So when we look at, I'll first start with the epidemiological observational evidence. We do have correlations showing that people who get brighter nights have increased diabetes. Sean Kane and his team did a great paper on this. It was 400,000 participants looking at their personal light exposure. So it was around 13 million hours of light exposure data where they wore a wristband, so tracking how much light they were exposed to day and night. And what they saw, and then they correlated that with diabetes. And what they saw was that the people who got the brightest nighttime light, so getting a lot of artificial light at night, had the highest rates of diabetes. And then also at the same time, the people who got the brightest daytime light, so getting a lot of bright light during the day, had the lowest rates of diabetes. And then the vice versa. So people who got the lowest daytime light had higher rates of diabetes. People who got the lowest nighttime light had the lower rates of diabetes. So again, like you said, brighter days, darker nights is going to have the best effect on metabolism and diabetes. Now, again, that's correlation. What's really interesting with that study is they accounted for a ton of variables, confounding variables, but they also accounted for genetic risk. So irrespective of these participants' genetic risk, they still had an increased risk or irrespective of the genetic risk, the light exposure itself still had an effect on their diabetes. So the light exposure itself had these increasing rates of diabetes, irrespective of genetics. Now, getting to these interesting human lab experiments. So now this isn't going to look at diabetes, but still a marker. So, and there's some papers where they, bring people into a lab, and they sleep there overnight for a few days. And what they do is they just have light shining on these participants while they're sleeping. So very dim light, though. This is not like bright. It's not like they flip the lights on at night. It's a super dim light, but obviously enriched in those blue wavelengths of light while these people are sleeping. And they monitor their blood glucose. And they're looking at blood glucose before they go to bed, and then looking at blood glucose after they go to bed. They have control group, experimental group, and all these things. And they see that the people who got exposed to the dim, it's still very dim artificial light, but at night while they're sleeping, had much elevated fasting blood glucose levels upon waking. Cortisol also, there was an effect on cortisol. So they had dysregulated cortisol rhythms when they were waking up. So, and these are things, again, going to the metabolism. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, so it regulates when glucose goes into our muscles and things like that. And then obviously elevated blood glucose is a sign of poor metabolic health, which can lead to prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So there's plenty and plenty of evidence. We have obviously a ton of animal model experiments on this as well, observational experiments and the lab experiments all sort of corroborate on this one idea as of getting artificial light at night has negative health consequences on multiple levels, not just cancer. I mean, obviously the cancer is a huge one, but on pretty much every single chronic disease. So again, it sort of just points to what you said. We want dark nights and we want bright days, and that's how we're going to reduce our risk for these chronic diseases.
So a lot of my audience lives through like darker northern winters. Like I'm from the Netherlands, so we have pretty gray, dark winters, and a lot of people work indoor like a lot of the time. And you mentioned before that our let's say our primordial state as human beings, like years upon years ago, we used to live around the equator where the days are equally long as the night. And obviously through human migration, we migrated away from the equator over thousands and thousands of years. So we ended up north, and we are experiencing very dark winters. Some people don't even experience daylight during their winters. How would you say that we should be going about our light exposure when we live in environments like that?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I think there's a lot of individual variability here. So I'll take a step back and just so when we look at the circadian rhythm and the sensitivity of light on the circadian rhythm, it's actually very, on an individual basis, it's actually very variable. So some people could be super sensitive to let's say light at night and effects on the rhythm. But some people can be very sort of resilient to light at night, where artificial light at night doesn't actually affect their rhythm as much. It's still going to have an
Mhm.
effect on the rhythm for sure, but not as much. So the individual variability it is pretty large. So I will say that. So for each person, it's going to differ a little bit. Now, to your point, right? It's like, we are designed to, for the most part, to be in a more equatorial area as it relates to circadian rhythms. Now, that's not to say that there are definitely some populations that have adapted to, longer days or shorter days. And like you said, some people don't get any light into their eyes at all just because there is no light where they are if they're super far up north. So I would say there's a few things people can do. I think it is very important to still have, especially, okay, so especially people like are working normal shifts, right? It's still very important to sort of keep that rough 12-12 in terms of, 12 hours of day, 12 hours a night, roughly. Obviously that it doesn't need to be exactly, but it's still important to keep that consistency. So there's some things people can do artificially. So, you can get like a sad lamp,
Mm.
10,000 lux bright light lamp that people can utilize that can be effective. And there's different ways to utilize light in that scenario. I think a big one is getting, and this is sort of separate from a circadian perspective, but looking more at the mitochondria and light's effects on the mitochondria. We also want these longer wavelengths of red and infrared light, especially during the
Mhm.
winters when we are indoors a ton and our indoor environment doesn't have any longer wavelengths of infrared light. Utilizing incandescent light bulbs, utilizing devices that have these longer wavelengths of light can be very beneficial, especially during the winter months, and especially when again you are not getting outside a ton. I would say that's a big one, and really being just consistent with sleeping and waking. So again, like I mentioned, your rhythm is going to still go on even if you're in a cave, right? So the rhythm still runs. It's not like it just shuts down completely. Again, you're
Mhm.
training your rhythm with the light, but you're also in training your rhythm when you go to bed and when you wake up. So having a consistent wake up time and sleep time is probably going to be one of the biggest things and levers that people can utilize, especially people who are up north and things like that. There was again, going back to Sean Kane and his colleagues, there was a paper that he published in, I think, 2023, where they were looking at mortality among a large population size, and they were looking at sleep, and they were looking at sleep regularity versus sleep duration. And
Mm.
what they actually found is that what affects mortality the most and at a much greater scale is sleep consistency and sleep rather than sleep duration. So if we can keep the consistency of sleep, so waking up at the same time every day and going to bed at the same time every day, that's going to have a larger effect than actually sleep duration in general. So, everyone talks about
Mhm.
get your 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep every night. Yeah, that's great. But we want to keep that consistency. We want to keep that 7 and 8 hours consistent of when we are getting that 7 and 8 hours of sleep. So I think that's a really big lever people can utilize consistency. And again, utilizing bright lights indoors can be great. But again, if you are in an area that has, that bright that has daytime light during the winter months, still just try to get out there as much as possible. Being near a window like you are right now and I am, like that's really important as well. Having that dynamic lighting throughout the day
Mhm.
is great. So those are some tips that I would probably recommend for people. And again, people who are exposed to no, they don't have if the sun isn't coming out at all, like it's literally just nighttime all day long, very up north, still turning on those lights when you wake up and turning them down when you go to bed. So that's probably the biggest thing that people can do.
Mhm. One of the things that I usually tell my clients when they are far, like up north, to have them support the infrared spectrum is fire. Like
Yeah,
working with fire, being in front of the
for sure.
fire, opening your fireplace to make sure that at night you have that cue.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that would be huge. If people have access to fire and a fireplace at night, that should be the only light that they are exposed to
Hmm.
at their nighttime. So that is great. And again, why is fire such a great sort of light to use at night? I mean, it's really like the first artificial light that humans created. But one, fire has no blue light, is very dim, and it's very low to the ground. So you're having those three things stacking up on each other that makes fire such a great light to use that doesn't affect the circadian system very much. So yeah, that's a great option to do.
Yeah. So, as you know, I work with women mostly, and I'm interested to know, does circadian disruption as we know it in our society today, does it happen differently in women's bodies given that they go through a, let's say, a bigger infradian rhythm than men? Obviously, a sperm cycle is also very infradian. Like, I don't,
Yeah.
there is this idea right now, like, oh, men are circadian and women are infrared. I'm like, no, people, that's not how it is. We all have both.
Yeah.
But given that women go through such a more expansive infradian rhythm and bigger hormone drops and rises, how does circadian disruption impact that from your perspective, from what you've seen and learned?
Yeah, I'll even say, something on the circadian rhythm for men versus for men versus women. So women actually have, like I mentioned, the on average humans circadian system is 24.2 hours. Women
Mhm.
have a shorter circadian rhythm typically. Again, that's gonna vary, but on average, women have a shorter circadian rhythm than men. So it's actually gonna be shorter than 24 hours, which actually makes them more sensitive to just light cues on the circadian rhythm. So I would say, for them, it's probably even more important. And again, going back to hormones, right? It's probably even more important to really lock in the just light cues in general, and really focusing on not getting artificial light as much as possible at night because they're going to be even more sensitive. So that, I think one of the also faults of science is a lot of studies aren't looking at women. I mean, nowadays
Mhm.
we're getting a lot more, but for the vast majority, especially in the very beginning of circadian research, I mean, pretty much everything was just on men and male
Mhm.
animal models. I don't think they were utilizing very much, and that's really in much of like endocrinology and a lot of just hormone based research definitely in the very beginning. It's coming around, but definitely in the very beginning, they weren't utilizing women at all because again, it's harder for the researchers, quite frankly, and they want to just make it easy for themselves, so they'll just use the men who don't
Yeah.
have these big fluctuations as women do. So I would say it's hopefully we can get some more research on this, but it is definitely apparent that women are going to be more sensitive to this, and it's going to have a larger effect on them. And yeah, and again, I haven't done a whole ton of research on what the research we have on women is. But again, I do know that women are going to be more sensitive to a degree.
Mhm. There is quite some research out there. Wait, we spoke
Yeah.
about this earlier connected to fertility, but there's also some
Yeah.
research on like perimenopausal women because their hormones are obviously like fluctuating and shifting and changing, and they're
Hmm.
more sensitive for even circadian disruption. Like
Hmm.
specifically shift workers who are perimenopausal, it's like the worst
Hmm.
combination that you can
Yeah.
go through. And then there also have been some connections between like premenstrual
Hmm.
issues, PMDD, and circadian disruption. So there is some stuff out there, but
Yeah.
it's like it's a bit tiny,
Yeah.
tiny
Yeah.
pile of research. Like we need much
Yeah.
more,
Yeah. For sure.
for
100%.
sure. Yeah. So, and what are some of the things that healthcare practitioners and people in general get wrong about this whole circadian rhythm thing?
Sure. Yeah. A few things. I'll say there's one quick thing since we already touched on this, but that circadian dead zone, that concept of that in humans is obviously, like we mentioned, is wrong. We need to
Mhm.
understand that even getting bright light throughout the day is very important. So that's one thing I think a lot of people get wrong. And I mean, quite frankly, I got wrong until having this conversation with Sean Kane. A couple other things. I mean, I would probably say the biggest one. I mean, obviously, I am, in college right now, so I'm really focused on younger people and people my age and my generation. I think the biggest thing is they just don't see well a few things. One, they don't understand that like light at night, let's say, or and also getting light in the day is important and has an effect
Mhm.
on the rhythm. Now we do learn, like, I mean, obviously I've been in some entry level bio classes and other more advanced bio classes, and we do learn about the circadian rhythm for the most part, but it is not, it's sort of just talked about like mechanisms and things like that, not a whole ton on outcomes and sort of consequences and things
Mhm.
along those lines. So I think, getting people to, especially my generation, to understand that like these effects are dramatic and they're real. And yes, perhaps you're not going to see a negative effect right now, but because, the body's very resilient, which is great. But, down the road, there's going to be consequences for getting artificial light at night and not getting enough bright light
Mm-hmm.
throughout the day. So I think, sort of making that message just more known in that space and within my generation. And then again to medical doctors, I think for them to understand that the circadian rhythm is super important. And
Mm-hmm.
when they're dealing with patients and things like that, circadian biology isn't even a focus. Now, one of my, favorite things to touch on here is like dermatology. So, like dermatology, obviously they, abdicate get as little amount of sunlight as possible and direct sunlight as possible. And,
Yeah.
there's obviously there's risks and benefits to everything. There's risks and benefits to sunlight. We need to utilize the sunlight properly. This is getting into just direct sun exposure. But, one of the big things is like, so, like I mentioned, every tumor suppressor protein and every regulator of skin cancer is actually and DNA repair mechanisms are all under circadian control. So it's really interesting. There's one of the main DNA repair mechanisms for UV induced DNA damage is this protein called NER, and NER gets expressed the most if our rhythm is aligned. It gets expressed the most in the middle of the day when we would be exposed to those high amounts of UV light from the sun, and it starts going down at night when we don't really need NER to be expressed. We don't
Mm-hmm.
need DNA to be cleaned up as much. So in that scenario, that circadian aligned scenario, it's perfect. We're getting exposed to, bright a lot of UV light in the middle of the day. DNA is breaking just as that just happens naturally, and there's actually some beneficial effects of that. But for the most part, we don't want DNA to be damaged long term, and that's why NER gets expressed the most during that time when DNA is going to be damaged the most. Now, if our central circadian rhythm is misaligned, that's going to have a effect on all the circadian systems, and one of those being the NER rhythm. So NER can either be shifted, so now we don't have NER being expressed in the middle of the day, or it can be blunted. The amplitude can be blunted. We don't have enough
Mm-hmm.
NER being expressed. So when we look at like in skin cancer and dermatology, it's like they're not even taking into the consideration circadian biology, right? So I think, if we can just if dermatologists, told their patients, all right, get your circadian rhythm aligned, well, then they probably wouldn't have to be dealing with so many skin cancers as much as they are. Obviously, it's not the perfect cure. Getting your circadian rhythm in line isn't going to prevent you 100% from skin cancers, but it's going to have a dramatic effect. One, like no doubt about it. I mean, we look at, it's unethical to obviously do this on humans, but we look at animal models where if we misalign the animal circadian system, in looking at skin cancer specifically, obviously I mentioned cancers in general, but skin cancer specifically, we have skin cancer increase, right?
Yeah.
Simply because their rhythm is misaligned. So, I think getting this into dermatology, but getting this into the medical establishment as a whole. And like I said, I think things are hopefully changing with, the American Heart Association, coming out with their statement on circadian rhythm and biology, circadian biology on cardiovascular, cardiometabolic effects. So I think things are changing, hopefully. But yeah, just coming to this realization that it has a profound effect. And if we
Mm-hmm.
if we if we understand that, if we start preaching it more, if we start telling patients that we can have a big effect on patients' health.
Mm, I definitely agree with that. And it's like so under discussed in so many fields. And then we haven't even talked about children and children on screens. And
Yeah.
like it's something that I'm at the age where we're like exploring to have kids and like seeing people around me, like their babies are like 2 years old, 3 years old. And the first thing that they get in the morning is their iPad. And I'm like, wow, what kind of effect does that have on these little brains that are like still neurologically developing and
Yeah.
in such a crucial stage of development where the foundations of all the neurological connections are laid. And yeah, it's just something I'm really worried about. And I personally believe that doctors should advise parents to not expose their children to artificial light up until a certain age because it's so damaging to their development. And you can't
100%.
you can't like redo your development
Yeah.
when you are a
Yeah.
kid. Yeah.
Yeah, touching on like, newborns a little bit. There was a paper published in Cell not too long ago where this was on mice, but what they were looking at is newborn mice from the ages of, from neonatal day 1 to day 9. These mice, and also in humans, our rods and cones aren't functioning, but our intrinsically
Mm.
photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are.
Ah,
And what they
interesting.
were yeah, and what they were seeing is that when we are essentially when we get bright light into the eyes into these newborn mice eyes within that first, not a 1 to 9 days of being born, a few things occur. One, the actual synaptogenesis, the formation of synapses within the brain actually increases, and also the mechanism there is with like oxytocin and all this. But synaptogenesis increases. What they also saw, they looked at these mice over time and into adulthood, their cognition was improved,
Oh, wow.
simply by getting the bright light in the first 9 days of life, right? Uh, and again, this is not visual. This is all intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, so non-visual forming, having an effect on literally the brain cell formation and development. So yeah, it has effect. And even those researchers, obviously, this was done on mice, but they talk about the human relevancy, and there's definitely a lot of relevancy. All the mechanisms and everything is conserved in humans, so it would make sense that this also happens in humans. So even within the first few days of your baby being born, like getting them outdoors, and again, you don't need to expose them to direct sun exposure. They can be under shade, but just getting that brightness of light into their eyes is going to be so helpful for like right then and there on their brain development, but then long term. So I think on cognition. So it's super important for children as well. And you're right. We need to not have children being on these devices all the time. And circadian aside, it's also having the short wavelength blue light in isolation is going to have effects on the cell viability, just from
Hmm.
a cellular perspective. And the retina is the most sensitive. I mean, the eyes are basically just a projection of the brain. So you're having this layer of brain that isn't really protected much. Our internal organs are protected because we have skin. So our skin is protected of that, but we have the retina that isn't protected very much. Getting the blue light penetrates completely through the lens of the eye and reaches pretty much 100% of the spectrum of blue. Yeah, 100% of the spectrum of blue reaches the retina. And
Hmm.
so, we're exposing a very vulnerable layer of tissue to artificial isolated blue light that is going to have cellular damaging effects as well. And, we see high rates of myopia and all these things in children. So, yeah, there's a lot of problems with, the, screens and things like that. And we want to limit them as much as possible.
Yeah, I really wish that there's more and more awareness around this because this is another thing people don't know. People have no idea.
Yeah. Well, I will
Uh,
say here, let's see, it's over here. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen this. It's called the Daylight tablet. Have you seen this?
I have seen that, yeah, but
Yeah.
I've seen it like online, but I don't know anyone who has one.
Yeah. Yeah. So this thing is awesome. I've been using it. I've had it for a while now, but it it doesn't emit any blue light. It's meant to be used outdoors, so it like works the best when it's outdoors in terms because it doesn't emit any light. It only
Ah,
reflects light. So when you're
oh,
outdoors, obviously it's much brighter. You're gonna have a lot more reflecting light coming back, so it's gonna be more visible. You can still utilize it indoors, super easy, but it's best to be used outdoors. So no blue light, no flicker, meant to be used outdoors. So it's a great device, and like for kids, it's all I think they have like a kid friendly one specifically for kids, but they're a great company. I'm a big supporter of what they're doing.
what's the name of it?
It's called the Daylight tablet or Daylight
Daylight,
computer.
Daylight computer. I'll
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah.
And to finish, I would love to ask you what your own daily relationship with light and dark is and how that could potentially translate to all of us in doing better with our light and dark exposure.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So I'm fortunate enough. I live in well right now I'm in South Florida, so I'm much closer to the equator. So I've tons of natural daylight throughout the year, which is amazing. But what I do, I'm also fortunate. I live super close to the beach, so I live like 5 minutes from the beach. So in the mornings, I typically wake up before sunrise. I'll drive 5 minutes to the beach. I watch the sunrise come up the horizon at the beach, which is lovely. And again, you don't. This isn't a necessity. So if you don't have access to this, it's not the end of the world, like we mentioned in the beginning. But yeah, so I see the sunrise at the beach, and then I try to just get as much light exposure throughout the day. So back at home during the summer, I'm fortunate enough, I can work just like outside. I have a nice desk outside, so I'm pretty much outside most of the day. Back up in school, I'm in classes indoors, have to work in the library sometimes. And so I'll be outdoors a little less, but always for lunch, I'm always outdoors for lunch. Lunch break is your best time to go outside. There's no commitment to being indoors. You can always take it outside. So I'm always outdoors for lunch. So and yeah, so just being consistent with trying to mitigate artificial light during the day and trying to get as much bright daylight throughout the day as well. And then nighttime is really the big one for me. So at night, I have no overhead lights on. I only have little lamps, and the lamps are either amber incandescent light bulbs. So no, I've tested the spectrum on like the ones I use. There's basically no blue light. And then I also there's a company called Raw Optics. They just came out with the new light bulb called Lumios. I have one in front of me right here. But their nighttime bulb, the candle bulb, is blue light free, has a very nice spectrum, tons of near infrared, and very nice and dim. So my nighttime light environment is very dim, no blue light, nice and amber. Some people will utilize like red light bulbs. I'm not a fan of them just personally. I just don't like how they make me feel, the deep red ones. Some people actually find it really relaxing. Some people find it stimulating. So it's going to affect individuals differently. I tend to lean more toward just amber. And again, that's more like firelight. Firelight's not just one monochromatic red. It's a more broader and it's amber. So super, super, super dim environment. And then, going, in this, this is obviously after the sun sets. Before the sun sets, I do try to, be outside for a period of time while the sun is setting. I don't see the sunset, but obviously the atmosphere is obviously getting dimmer. So just being outdoors during that period, coming back indoors afterwards, having that light environment on after that sunset. And then again, trying to get to bed early so I can naturally wake up early in the morning for sunrise. So that's sort of my day-to-day light environment and how I do it.
And do you also have like specific times that you cue your meals?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I don't eat. I've just grown up never eating breakfast. I intermittent fast until like lunchtime. So I'll have lunch, middle of the day. And then for dinner, I try to have earlier dinner as possible. So typically my dinner is like during the winter, it's like 5 p.m. During the summer, I will extend that a little bit later, just because, the sun is setting later. So I'll extend that to 6. Sometimes it's still 5 o'clock, but 5, 6 o'clock is usually when I have dinner, trying to keep that earlier, the better. So, I can not go to bed like super full stomach. I always go on a walk after I eat, which is great for glucose regulation. Not only are you contracting your muscle to, take in glucose, but you're also exposing yourself to longer wavelengths of light from the sun, which is going to have a dramatic effect on blood glucose levels as well. So yeah, that's what I do for meal timing.
Yeah, cool. I do the same things, except I have a huge breakfast.
Yeah.
I think as a woman, it's a bit different. I think
for sure.
For male bodies, intermittent fasting is just easier to do, and it's more in alignment with their nervous system.
Yep, for sure.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and your knowledge. I'm really excited to see what's in store for you, what kind of research you're going to be publishing all throughout your life. So if that comes out, please post about it.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Iris. This was a fun conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, this wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Want to know more about me? The best way to reach me is via @CycleSeeds on Instagram. And if you heard something today and you think, oh my God, wow, I learned something new, feel free to share the podcast on your social media and tag me. Or leave a review or rating. In this way, you help me reach more people like you. Thank you so much.